Sephardic Genealogical Society. And today, our guest speaker is Heide Warnke. Heide was born in Hamburg and studied Semitic language at the University of Amsterdam. In 2012, she started working at the library Ets Haim, which is housed in the synagogue, the Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam. It's the oldest still functioning Jewish library in the whole world. She was appointed a curator of Ets Haim in 2016, and she is currently writing a dissertation with the title The Amsterdam Hebrew Printing Industry and the Impact of Intellectual, Economic, and Religious Developments on Hebrew Printing. We are very proud to have Heide on the program, and she will take us on a tour through the beautiful manuscripts and printed books held in Amsterdam's Ets Haim Library. Heide.
Thank you very much, Ton, for this introduction. I will share my screen now. I hope that it works. So I hope that you all can see my screen now. Today I would like to tell you something about the manuscript culture of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam. And I also want to give you an idea of the challenges Jewish printers in Amsterdam faced from within their community and how they interacted with different confessional and social environments. And I will do that by showing you manuscripts and printed books from the collection of the library at Ets Haim Montesinos here in Amsterdam. And as Ton said before, the history of the library goes back more than 400 years to the year 1616. It's the oldest active Jewish library in the world. And to understand what makes the collection of the library so unique, I would like to start by giving you some background on the history of the settlement of Portuguese Jews here in Amsterdam. For that, I will go back to the Iberian Peninsula to explain in a nutshell, because I'm sure that you know the history. I will explain the difference between the Eastern and the Western Sephardic diaspora, because this defines the nature of the congregation in Amsterdam and the collection of the libraries. It's very important. So I will start by showing you this map that, and I will show you that the years 1492, the expulsion from Spain, and 1536, the Inquisition in Portugal, actually led to two different flows of refugees, and with that to two parts of the Sephardic diaspora. In 1492, many Jews fled from Spain to northern Africa and the eastern part of the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and Greece. Many went to Portugal, hoping to stay out of the hands of the Inquisition. But that plan didn't work out. In 1497, the Jews in Portugal were also forced to convert, and 1 year later, there were no Jews left on the Iberian Peninsula. When the Inquisition in Portugal was formally established in 1536, the Jews, conversos by that time, fled back to Spain and to the western part of the mainland, to France, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and later Hamburg and London. In Spain, this group was called Portuguese Jews, and those are the people who came to Amsterdam and were also called Portuguese Jews here. So in general, we can say that the eastern part of the Sephardic diaspora, the Ottoman Empire, consisted of Jews, whereas the western part, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, consisted of conversos. And why is this important? Because in the eastern part, there was a continuity of Jewish tradition, and in the western part, for example, in Amsterdam, there was no continuity. So in Amsterdam, the Jews had to start from scratch, learning about Jewish tradition, custom, and identity. So Amsterdam was focused on a converso community, and that focus defines the character of the collection of Ets Haim. It is the library of the school of the congregation and reflects the need for education. Jews settled in the city of Amsterdam in the spring of 1593, when the first conversos arrived in Amsterdam from the Iberian Peninsula. At first, services took place in private houses, and in 1602, the first Sephardic synagogue and congregation was built, Beit Yaakov. Two other congregations were founded in 1608, Neve Shalom, and in 1618, Beit Yisrael. These three congregations merged into one called Talmud Torah in 1639 and gathered in the building of Beit Yisrael. And you see this building here on a copper engraving by Romein de Hoge. For many generations, those newcomers to Amsterdam had been silenced by the Inquisition on the Iberian Peninsula and had been cut off from active Jewish life. They had to find a Jewish identity, so education was of the essence. Therefore, not only a synagogue was built to hold regular services, also a school and a library were established in 1616. And over time, both were called Ets Haim. In 1675, the Portuguese synagogue was inaugurated and the congregation moved to its present location. This is Ets Haim. It is on the premises of the Portuguese synagogue and it is part of the Jewish cultural quarter in Amsterdam. The synagogue is lit by, so this is the interior of the synagogue, it's lit by candlelight and there's no electricity or heating. So if you have a chance to come to Amsterdam, you really have to visit this. It's absolutely beautiful. Since its foundation, the library at Haim has always employed a librarian, and by far the most influential of these was David Montesinos, who served the library for 50 years. He also had a private book collection, and in 1889 he decided to give his collection to Ets Haim. So the library is now much bigger, or from that time on, much bigger, the collection, than it was before that. He really wanted the library to always have the name Ets Haim Livraria Montesinos, which is the official name now. Well, for librarians, I don't know if there are any librarians in the audience, but have a look at the stove and the inkwells on the table. It really is a nightmare for every curator in our days. Times have changed, but the collection survived. Today, the library holds about 600 manuscripts and 23,000 printed books, and is the oldest active Jewish library in the world. Like we said before, more than 400 years old. It is mainly a research library for scholars from around the world. And just to give you an idea of the books that we have, of the collection itself, as well as Hebrew books, the collection contains many Portuguese and Spanish manuscripts and printed works. In general, Spanish was the language of the literature, and Portuguese was the language for everyday life and the administration of the congregation. Ladino was never spoken in the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam, because it's the language of the first wave who fled Spain as Jews, so the Eastern Sephardic diaspora. This is the book from the collection of the library that was printed when the Portuguese synagogue was inaugurated in 1675. The inauguration actually took 8 full days. And in it, we have 3 copies of it. In one of the copies, there also is a little manuscript with a list of costs of building, which is very, very interesting because it really gives you an idea also about the people that were working on building the synagogue. And it's really interesting to read also the people who financed it and who had the most money and who laid the cornerstones. The first sermon was held by Rabbi Chacham, so Chief Rabbi Isaac Aboab da Fonseca, He also took the initiative to build the Portuguese synagogue in 1671. The congregation was growing and really needed a bigger synagogue. What you also find in the same book is this engraving of the inauguration ceremony. And what you see here is a procession with at its head Chacham Isaac Abob da Fonseca. You have to believe me because it's very difficult to see, but because he was the chief rabbi, it was an honor for him to be the first to bring the Torah scroll to the Hechal, the ark with the Torah scrolls. And what you also see here in front are festively dressed burgomasters, women, and aldermen of Amsterdam, who were all invited and were very curious of what was happening inside, and because they saw that the building was going on of this very big synagogue, so they really wanted to see what was going on inside as well. Especially in the first half of the 17th century, rabbis from the eastern part of the Sephardic diaspora came to Holland. Names like Joseph Pardo from Venice, Judah Vega from Constantinople, Isaac Uziel from Fez, and Saul Levi Mortera, very famous, from Venice. And these rabbis, who didn't have a converso background, corrected, so to speak, the Catholic elements and took care of the uniform rules according to halakha, the Jewish law. And Venice played a very important normative role in it and was the religious authority for the Amsterdam Jewish community. It had a kind of institutional continuity that served as a seal of quality for Amsterdam, so very important for Amsterdam. And that correcting the Catholic elements was indeed necessary was clear from the very beginning, because the newcomers to Amsterdam called the matzes the holy bread, and Purim they called the feast of the holy Esther. So you can see that there were a lot of Catholic elements in their traditions. Also, I mean, recent research has shown that the Jews on the Iberian Peninsula only encountered rabbinic Judaism relatively late. And again, because of the Inquisition, there was no continuation of this. I will come back to that point later on. So here in Amsterdam, immediately education was provided for the newcomers to close the gap of the many generations of conversos who knew little about their own Jewish tradition anymore. And this is the former classroom of Ets Haim. It's now the Winter Synagogue. And this is the classroom from the year 1675 onwards, when after the Portuguese synagogue was inaugurated. Starting with the Hebrew alphabet until the highest Talmud studies, also the trivium, so grammar, rhetoric, and logic, essential to classical education, was part of the curriculum. And also secular subjects that were not on the curriculum in other Jewish schools in Europe, like didactic poetry, for example. And special attention was given to translations from and into Spanish, because Spanish was the literary language of the congregation. The school was seen as unique in the Jewish world in the 17th century and impressed and moved many visitors, especially because of the excellent quality of the curriculum. The focus of the Portuguese congregation on learning Torah before the rabbinic texts impressed many visitors, especially from Eastern Europe. And we know this from an eyewitness account in this book. It's called Shnei Luchot HaBrit, in our collection, written by Jesaja Hurwitz and printed in Amsterdam in 1648 and again in 1695. In an appendix to this book, Vavei HaAmudim, written by Jesaja's son, Shabtai Sheftel Hurwitz, he praises the educational system of the school Ets Haim, and I quote, "I saw there," which is Ets Haim, that little children learned Torah, and after that the rest of the Bible, then Mishnah, and only when they are 13 years old they learn to read the Talmud. With tears in my eyes, I wondered why we don't do this in our congregation, and this is very likely Prague. May this tradition spread through the whole Jewish world. So the educational system at the school and Ets Haim was very, very special. Even in the 17th century, it was really seen like that. And the book Shnei Luchot HaBrit is one of the most important ethical works for Ashkenazi Jews. On the title page, we see Moses and Aaron, King David with the harp, and most likely King Solomon. And next to it, I put an image made by the same engraver for the famous Amsterdam Haggadah, printed in 1695, which also is in our collection. And this is colored in by hand. It's a printed book. I would now like to show you some manuscripts from our collection. Ets Haim holds about 600 manuscripts, and most of them were written in the 17th and 18th century. Printing with movable type was invented in 1450, and it is striking that in the Portuguese community in Amsterdam still so many manuscripts were produced. It's there are actually three. I think that there are three main reasons for this, and one is that this was a way to express identity. And from looking at our manuscripts, it becomes clear that the Iberian identity was very much cherished, which is interesting, and I think it would be very good to do some more research on it, because those people were driven from the Iberian Peninsula, but still very much cherished the Iberian identity. So these are examples of title pages of books that we have in the collection. You can really see this Iberian sentiment here, and all of them were written in Amsterdam, and all of the illustrations have a very distinct Iberian character. And to give you an idea, this is a slide with which I want to compare Islamic art from the 10th and 11th century with some details from our manuscripts. On the left, Medinat, the capital of Medinat Azahara. For example, it was a walled city, the administrative capital of Al-Andalus, close to Cordoba, and you can see that the inspiration for the illustrations of our title pages are very, very much drawn from that time and from those buildings and images. But also using a particular script can express identity, like in the following example. And that is about the fact that the expulsion from Spain in the 15th century marked a change in focus. Messianism and apocalyptic thoughts became important, and the Amsterdam community began to search for signs of when the long-awaited Messiah would come to bring them to the Holy Land. In the summer of the year 1665, the news arrived in Amsterdam that a man named Shabtai Tzvi from Smyrna, now Istanbul, called himself the Messiah of the Jews. And in less than 6 months after his proclamation in July 1665, the world was at his feet. Gazettes and newspapers were printed, and eyewitness accounts and stories of miracles that had happened reached the city. Most Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam had family, business, or contacts in the Ottoman Empire and received their information straight from the source. And when letters from Nathan of Gaza arrived in Amsterdam, everything seemed to be confirmed. Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam sold everything, including their houses, and danced on the street because they believed that the end of their exile was near. Even special prayer books were printed. We see one of those prayer books here with chapter Tzvi on his throne, printed in 1666. This book was printed by David de Castro Tartas, who also printed the book for the inauguration of the Portuguese synagogue in 1675. He really was traumatized when he found out that Shepherd Tzvi was not the Messiah, and the word has it that he didn't print for a whole year after that episode. So he really was traumatized. We actually don't have very much traces of this messianic episode found in Ets Haim. There seems to be evidence that this unfortunate chapter was best forgotten, but we do have a remarkable manuscript in the collection, and that is a letter that was written by 24 famous leaders of the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam to hail Shepherd Tzvi as Messiah. This letter was sent, we know that, but never reached Tzvi, as it became clear that he was not the Messiah. The letter had long been lost and only came back into the collection in 1933, when a German bookseller offered it to Ets Haim because he felt that it belonged there. And in my view, the fact that it only came back in 1933 or in the 20th century saved it from the 17th century efforts to erase this piece of history, and it actually does give us a lot of information about how the people felt, the members of the congregation felt about this Messiah. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed IV, was not that happy with the proclaimed Messiah in his empire. He gave Tzvi the choice of shooting him with a bow and arrow, and if he survived, it would be a miracle, and then we would be absolutely sure that Tzvi was the Messiah, or converting to Islam. Tzvi did convert to Islam. I always say he must have been a very practical man, because I don't think that he believed in a miracle, and he really left his followers worldwide traumatized, and also in Amsterdam. His name became Aziz Mehmed Effendi. The letter was written in a script that was not contemporary. The writing style of this letter is a pre-expulsion Sephardic script, nearly 200 years after the expulsion, which is very interesting because this letter is from 1666 and the script is much older. Why? Because it fitted neatly into the idea of the Sephardic roots and would have meant an immediate connection between Shepherd Tzvi and the Amsterdam Jews, as Shepherd Tzvi also was Sephardic. And again, it expresses identity. I think that the congregation was very much aware that Shepherd Tzvi would recognize this and would be able to read it, and that they would have an immediate connection with this man, which they really wanted. Apart from expressing identity, there is another reason for publishing a work only as a manuscript. And that is very interesting because this has to do with the strict policy of the Mahamat, the board of governors of the congregation in Amsterdam. Everyone who wanted to print a book needed their permission. And that led to a kind of self-censorship, internal censorship, you could call it as well, by circulating certain potentially controversial texts only in manuscript, because they knew that they wouldn't get the permission to print a certain book. And a good example is a manuscript by Chacham Saul Levi Mortera, Chief Rabbi Mortera. He was born in Venice in 1596. He came to Amsterdam in 1616 and became rabbi of the congregation Bet Yaakov in 1618. In general, we can say that his approach to Jewish law was quite strict and very intellectual. And shortly before he died in 1660, he finished writing his magnum opus, Tratado da Verdade da Lei de Moisés, in Portuguese. And it is a commentary on the Old and the New Testament. One of his goals is to convince the reader of the fact that the New Testament doesn't have a divine origin, and that they should believe in a religion that is only based on the Old Testament. His work was actually aimed at the Jewish reader, not at the Christian reader, but at the Jewish reader. And this work was never printed because it was openly challenging to the Christian faith, and he also knew that he would never get permission to print this work. Mortera also seems to have had a sense of drama. The manuscript ends with the word morto, death. You can see it here in the winter of 1660. And rumor has it that Mortera wrote this word down, dropped the pen, and died. At least this is what I always think when I see this. we don't know, but he died in the year 1660. And soon after his death, so this work was written in Portuguese. Soon after his death, his work was translated into Spanish with the title Providencia de Dios con Israel. And we have a couple of versions of this manuscript in the collection. All were copied by hand. Again, as a form of self-censorship, the work was never printed. The Mahamat, the Parnasim, the members of the Board of Governors were very, very careful that no Jew would overstep the delicate boundary line so as not to offend the Christian sensibilities. But there is a third, completely different reason for the continuation of a manuscript tradition, and that is not limited to the Portuguese congregation. It has to do with fashion. Especially in the 18th century, there was a revival of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, and these manuscript illustrations were influenced by the Amsterdam Haggadah, which you have seen before, printed in 1695. This is the title page of the Haggadah, of the Amsterdam Haggadah, and next to it, you see a manuscript title page of a Haggadah made by Nathan of Meseretz from Moravia in 1728. And as you can see, it is very much alike, especially the figures of Moses and Aaron. So the Amsterdam Haggadah from 1695 really was the blueprint, so to speak, of the handwriting that you see on your right. And another example is this. These are the four sons in the printed Amsterdam Haggadah. These are the four sons in the Leipzig Haggadah from 1734 by Joseph ben David of Leipzig. And it's very interesting to browse through that manuscript. He reinterpreted the Haggadah for his own time by depicting figures in 18th century European dress and surroundings. So if you have a look at the dresses, you can see what I mean. And these are the four sons in the manuscript of the Meseretz Haggadah. This actually is an exact copy of the Amsterdam Haggadah. You can see the two images on top of each other. And it's very interesting to see that the manuscript culture was influenced by the printed books in the 18th century. Before I tell you something about the print culture, I want to show you a beautiful piece in our collection which is not really connected to my subject today, but I will show you anyway because it's so beautiful, and I hope you will appreciate that. It's an Omer counter. The 49 days between Pesach, that celebrates the liberation from slavery in Egypt, and Shavuot, that celebrates that Moses has received the Torah. Those 49 days in between are called days of the Omer. And the Omer is a certain amount of grain which was given to the priest in Jerusalem as an offering. And the Omer time actually is the harvesting time. And by counting the days at a time when there was not a set calendar yet, the workers in the field knew exactly when to come home to celebrate Shavuot. The Omer counters in general can have many shapes, and within the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam, beautifully illuminated scrolls were kept in cabinets, and just a couple of those cabinets still exist. I know of, I think about 5 in the world, maybe they are more, but just a couple are still, we still have. And this one is from the 18th century. The letters H, the letter stands for Omer, because for those of you who speak Hebrew, the Hebrew letter Ein was always pronounced with an H in transcription. The S is Semana, week, and the D is Dia. So in it you will find a little scroll, and you can just turn it, and you will have the 49 days until Shavuot. So let's now talk about Hebrew printed books in the Netherlands. Hebrew books before 1627 in the Netherlands were exclusively printed for academic purposes at the universities of Leiden and Franeker by Christian printers for Christian scholars. And the Hebrew books for the Jewish congregation at that time came to Amsterdam from all important places of Hebrew printing, mainly from Italy, Constantinople, and Salonika. That means that all the books from before 1627, Hebrew books, came from other places. The Portuguese congregation flourished, and with it the need for Hebrew books transmitting ideas, thoughts, and concepts for a Jewish reader grew. In 1627, the first Hebrew book for the Jewish reader was printed. The printers owned independent printing shops, while at the same time they were active members of their congregation. And as a consequence of the strong connection of the printers with the congregation, their board of governors exercised authority of what was allowed to be printed. We heard that earlier, that you really needed permission to print a book, which is a good reason not to ask permission and just circulate it in manuscript. So what I want to argue is that the scope of Hebrew printing and publishing by Jews in the Netherlands was determined 22 years before the first Hebrew book left the presses of a Jewish printer in Amsterdam. And those conditions were set in a charter in the year 1605 in the Dutch city of Haarlem, as a reply to a group of Portuguese Jews who asked permission to reside in the city. This is the charter, which is kept in the archives, North Holland archives. And the importance of this document is immense, because for the first time, all aspects of Jewish settlement were formulated in the Netherlands. Even though it was never implemented, it was used as a layout for observing the boundaries of tolerated conduct. It is remarkable that the Jewish petitioners had a strong negotiating position towards the city's authorities. They were even allowed to discuss the draft of the charter with the leaders of the Jewish congregation in Venice. And the strategy of the delegates was to influence the process by dangling a proverbial carrot in front of the city's authorities. That carrot was the prospect of attracting highly esteemed Jewish merchants from Italy and the Ottoman Empire to the city of Haarlem. The authorities also knew that one of the petitioners, Isaac Frankel, was a very wealthy man who had financially supported the Dutch East India Company. The Haarlem authorities were blinded. When we look at the clauses in the final charter that concern printing and publishing by the Portuguese Jews, we see that they were clearly drawn up with the idea of a business model in mind, which came from the Jewish leaders in Venice. It was intended to serve the freedom of printing of the Portuguese Jews in the Netherlands, as well as to safeguard an international business channel for Hebrew books from Italy. In clauses 13 and 14 of the Haarlem Charter, we read that they, the Jews, will be allowed to bring and receive from other places and Haarlem to print, have, and use all kinds of books in Hebrew or other languages, under the condition that they are not blasphemous against the Christian religion. However, that rule of governance, which was intended not to offend Christians, backfired and provided the board of the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam with a code of conduct that would eventually lead to internal censorship. We have seen that, and impact the freedom of printing. In no uncertain terms, the Charter also gives the city of Venice and other places of Hebrew printing in the Ottoman Empire permission to ship their books to the Low Countries. And that must have been music in the ears of one of the delegates, Isaac Franco, who in the year 1604 financed and published a little prayer book in Spanish using his alias name Franco de Mendoza, here on the left. In fear of the reaction of the city of Amsterdam's authorities, he doesn't mention the place of print on the title page, because many congregants didn't know Hebrew in the first half of the 17th century. The prayer book is in Spanish. The only Hebrew word is the title, Mahzor, and that's the prayer for the high holidays. And as Franco didn't have access to Hebrew typographical material, the Hebrew word Mahzor is in woodcut. So it's a beautiful combination of woodcut and movable type. There are also a couple of other Hebrew words in this book. It's beautiful. It's very small, actually, which you can't see on the screen. Franco continued to publish Spanish books for a Jewish audience, and he still did this with caution. And you can see that on the right, because he didn't mention the place of print on the title page. That book was printed in 1612. In 1608, Isaac Franco was one of the founders of the second Portuguese Jewish congregation, Neve Shalom. And from an inventory of all the books of the three congregations at the time that they merged in 1639, it becomes clear that Neve Shalom owned 4 times as many books as the other two congregations. Obviously, Isaac Franco immediately followed up on what the charter suggested, to bring and receive from other places books in Hebrew and other languages. The first Hebrew book that was printed by a Jew in the Netherlands was printed in 1627 by Manasseh ben Israel, a very famous man and of great importance for the readmission of the Jews to England. He was the chief rabbi of the congregation Neve Shalom, and he was born in 1604 in Lisbon, Portugal. Under pressure from the Inquisition, his family fled to Amsterdam, where they settled in 1613. When he was only 18 years old, he wrote this little Portuguese and Hebrew grammar that was never printed, and as far as I know, there are only 3 manuscripts left of this book of his. The first book that left Manasseh's presses in 1627 is a prayer book, and as such a direct response to the needs of the Sephardic congregation, who, like I explained earlier, had to learn, to be educated. The proofreader of this book and author of the foreword was Isaac da Fonseca. We've seen him before. He was also responsible for the building of the Portuguese synagogue. And Isaac da Fonseca was highly aware of the historical significance of this publication. So we see him and his foreword here. In his foreword, he consciously evokes echoes of the past and of early Hebrew printing in Italy, when manuscripts held the aesthetic standard. This is accentuated by the archaic layout of his introduction, which has features of an incunable. It looks like handwriting, and punctuation marks are absent. da Fonseca writes that Manasseh ben Israel came to the house of an artisan. He shaped the letters with a burin, as perfect as if cast in gold. In other words, the letters had been designed by the best scribe in town, and the cutting and casting was done by a craftsman who was so gifted that it was as if he had worked in a soft metal like gold. And this gifted craftsman was the type cutter Nicolas Briot. Above mentions that two men's hearts were lifted up to bring the work of printing a little Siddur, the like of which had never been since there were printers on the earth. And those two men were the publishers and financiers Ephraim Bueno and Abraham Sarfati. In his introduction, the proofreader above also alludes to the fact that printing this book was only possible with the intervention of God, who touched the heart of the learned and wise one Manasseh ben Israel. The craftsman, Michael Yehuda, who designed the letters for him, was promised that God will pay his work, and may his reward be fully by God, the God of Israel. The following 4 books of Manasseh's press are all printed primarily to educate the congregation, but it was his 6th book that caused him trouble. In the year 1629, Manasseh ben Israel started printing 2 Hebrew works of Joseph Salomon del Medico about physics, metaphysics, astronomy, Kabbalah. It was called Sefer Elim, and the second part Ma'ayan Gani. Del Medico was a pupil of Galileo Galilei in Italy, and his discussions in Sefer Elim are based on Galileo's ideas about the movement of the sun and planets. When the board of the congregation learned that printing of the work had already started, they intervened by wanting to assess the work. The presses had to be stopped, and Manasseh had to come before them to explain difficult passages of the text. And the first part contains a set of 12 questions, and not all of them are answered by Del Medico in the second part, and that proves that certain parts were censored by the board and were never printed. So we are talking about censorship by the congregation, by the board of governors. So what happens here is extraordinary. The charter for the settlement of Jews in the city of Haarlem, which was never implemented, served as an unofficial moral guideline for the Jewish board in Amsterdam. It backfires and turns inwards because the board uses the conditions of printing from the charters, which basically entail not to print anything that would offend the Christian religion, for censorship within their own ranks, because the book didn't comply to their congregational policy. Manasseh ben Israel learned the hard way that he should be careful with the output of his presses. On the title page of part 1 of the book Conciliador, which Manasseh authored, which was printed in 1632, he mentions Frankfurt as the place of print, whereas this book actually was printed by him in Amsterdam. It is very likely that he did this for fear of censorship from his own community. Well, you just heard that he didn't have the best experience with his own board. From the second part of the publication, he does mention Amsterdam. You can see that here. And now he proudly presents himself as author Manasseh ben Israel, Theologo e Filosofo Hebreo, and shows his famous printer's mark that he used for his non-Hebrew books, the pilgrim surrounded by the words, perceived as a pilgrim. This book was his first cooperation with a Christian printer, Nicolaas van Ravestein. By the way, because it's so beautiful, I want to show you this as well. This is another of Manasseh's printer's marks. It is a so-called magic square, 9 little squares with letters that can be read horizontally and vertically as words of a psalm. Emet me'eretz titzmach, which means faithfulness will spring from the earth. After a steep learning curve, Manasseh's attitude towards printing and publishing changed, and he became aware of the business possibilities that lay outside the congregation. He showed an excellent business sense in understanding the importance of his role as cultural liaison with the Christian world, turning his confessional background into an advantage for publishing. He broadened his horizon very quickly by responding to the inquisitiveness of Christian intellectuals and became an important mediator between the two parties. In 1631, he started to publish Hebrew Bibles for an international market in collaboration with the printer Henricus Laurentius. Experimenting with book sizes, he published the first ever pocket-size edition in Hebrew typography 2 years later. And in 1634, Manasseh discovered the Eastern European market. This beautiful type became an international trademark. Printers, especially from Eastern Europe, wanted to increase their sales by mentioning on their title pages that a specific book is printed with the Amsterdam types, the types of Manasseh. We can see that here. They did that by printing the word Amsterdam on the title page in large letters, and the actual printer's place was printed somewhere very small on the title page. You can see that here. So the book was not printed in Amsterdam. It was printed with the letters of Amsterdam. It was actually printed in Lemberg, Lviv in 1786. This would, of course, attract the attention, by the way, not only of also of catalogers. If you want to catalog this book, you have to be very careful not to think that it was printed in Amsterdam, but it definitely did attract the attention of possible buyers on, for example, the Frankfurt Book Fair. This book fair was the perfect marketplace to get to explore different markets and audiences, increase business opportunities, and form collaborations. The interesting thing is that Manasseh attended only once in the year 1634, and then at that time no Hebrew books were presented, but we know that at least 2 of the 8 attending publishers from Amsterdam were capable to print Hebrew. Manasseh immediately used the opportunity to claim his part in the publishing of Hebrew books when he collaborated in publishing a book of Psalms in 1635 with the printer and publisher Johannes Jansonius. Not only did Jansonius and Manasseh benefit from each other's professional reputation, they would also gain access to new audiences. The fact that Manasseh was also the rabbi of the Sephardic community must have been an extra seal of approval for Jansonius. And someone who approached the business from a different angle from the start is the printer Joseph Athias. From his early days of printing, Athias was an entrepreneur with an excellent business sense. He realized that he would have to broaden his business activities beyond the congregation and specialized in printing English Bibles for the English market and Hebrew Bibles for the general market. In 1666, he printed a Bible that would make him famous because he managed to get the approval of both the Jewish and the Christian authorities. It was dedicated to the Dutch States General of the United Provinces, and as a token of gratitude, he was awarded with a golden chain. The pride of Joseph Athias must have been deeply hurt when in 1669, Samuel Desmaret Maresius, professor of theology in Groningen, was openly critical about this Bible edition and about the fact that the States General accepted the dedication for the Bible, I quote, from this Jew enemy of Christ. Athias reacted immediately and didn't hesitate to implore Maresius to stop criticizing his, quote, widely celebrated masterpiece. If you continue to criticize my Bible anew, I will send you an immediate reply. For neither the mind nor printing is lacking, which means I am not afraid I have a printing press at my disposal, and enough learned helpers at my service. If you criticize me again with insults, I will print a book with the title Asinus ad liram, as suited to criticize as a donkey to play a lyre. Printing for Jews in those days, 40 years after the first book printed by a Jew left the presses in Amsterdam, still had its challenges. What changed was the decreasing need for internal censorship and the increasing confidence of the Jewish printers, who realized that printing gave them a powerful tool that reached far beyond their own ranks. Comparing these two title pages perfectly shows this increase in confidence. The plain functional title page of the first printer Manasseh in 1627, and the beautiful title page full of Christian and Jewish symbolism by Atias in 1666. By the way, I don't know if you could see it on your screen. To avoid any discussion or problems, the year doesn't read Anno Domini and then the year, but just Anno. In Manasseh's days, it would have been unheard of that a printer would get into a discussion with a Christian and would compare him with a donkey. The reaction of the board of the congregation is not handed down, but we can safely assume that they held their breath when they heard of the conflict between Maresius and Atias. What we do know is that a book with the title Asinus ad Liram, as a donkey on a lyre, was never printed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating, and you're so lucky to work in such a beautiful environment. My first question is about the sort of economics of the printing, because I can't imagine there's an enormous market for sort of sermons in Spanish for the Jewish community. So how do we know how they would finance the early printing?
Well, most of the time the early printing was actually in the cases that I've shown. So the little Mahzor and another prayer book, it was financed by Isaac Franco, who had quite a lot of money to be able to pay for those books, and later on it was financed also by people who found it important that those books were printed. When we look at the economics, what is very interesting is that's my personal theory about it, but that Manasseh, for example, was really an emotional printer. He printed what he felt was important to print, whereas, for example, Atias printed because he wanted to earn the money. He was really more of a businessman. So there is a difference, and especially when you look at the early days of printing, you will see that it was more led by emotion than by business opportunities or a business sense, actually.
So these works are commissioned works rather than, say, the sort of chapbooks that would be sold on the streets of London.
Yes, those were commissioned, and the library or the congregation commissioned quite a lot of books, especially in the beginning, just to learn from them.
Do you know why they're published in Spanish if Portuguese was the lingua franca? Is this some sort of nostalgia? It's like we like books in religious books in Old English, or is there some other reason?
Maybe nostalgia was also part of it, but well, actually the literary language was Spanish, so you will find also theater plays and poetry and those kinds of literature in Spanish, and the day-to-day, the administrative language as well was Portuguese. So maybe that was a reason, the difference between the more beautiful language maybe in their eyes and the language that they would speak every day.
Yes. Do you know if any of these books sort of found their way to Spain or Portugal?
If they did find their way to Spain and Portugal, I don't know actually. No, the other way around, we know. Sometimes I get the question, that some people ask if we have books in the library that actually were brought from Spain and Portugal, and I can say that I haven't seen any book in the library that came from Spain and Portugal, because it was very dangerous to bring those books with you, or to so the people would see that you were secretly Jewish. So the other way around, also, we don't have any evidence.
Yeah, no, because I saw a sermon preached by a rabbi in answer to a sermon preached by a bishop at an auto de fe. I can't remember in Spain or Portugal, but I guess
Oh,
it's
that's interesting. Yeah.
easier that way. But great. Thank you. Tom, over to you.
I've seen several pictures of Moses in your presentation, and they all seem to show Moses with rays sticking out of his head. Why is that?
Oh, yeah. I can't remember exactly. I know that the reason there is something with a translation error from the Vulgate, but I'm not quite sure. I don't really know the answer. So the original Hebrew word means beams of light, and it was translation error. And after that, he was depicted with horns. This is what I know, but I'm not quite sure if I'm right here. It has something to do
Yeah.
with the translation. Maybe someone else knows the answer.
A question about Ets Haim. From your description, it looks like it was organized like a Latin school was organized in Holland, with a fixed curriculum of subjects that students had to learn. Sometimes I have the impression that it was more organized like a yeshiva, that is, with a rabbi in charge and his pupils listening to him and all disputing each other. Which system had the upper hand?
That's difficult to say because the goal of the school of the education changed. In the first 100 years, it was more what I explained, an education for those newcomers to Amsterdam, whereas later it was more a school to educate rabbis. In general, we can say that the structure is really molded, or the curriculum is molded after the Jesuit schools that they knew, and the curriculum also, and that is very interesting, is different from other Jewish schools because they started with Torah and not with rabbinical scripts. So it's that makes it very different. But in the first 100 years, it was really educating the newcomers, and then after that, you will also have more of the discussions that you mentioned. In around the year 1700, the Ets Haim, so the responder, the Sheelot or Teshuvot, were introduced, where the students had to answer as an exam piece. They had to answer questions that were written by the rabbis, and then a discussion followed with the students, with their teachers, and also with the other students in class. So the curriculum in a way changed, and also the dynamics in the classroom changed.
You mentioned that the library is still used. What type of visitors do you get? And is it free to anybody to come and see the books for themselves?
Yeah, that would be, in an ideal world, I would say yes. Reality is that I'm the only one working there, so everyone who wants to come has to have an appointment, to make an appointment. We are open for scholars from all kinds of subjects because we have the collection is very broad. So what you find here are not only religious books, but all kinds of books, like I mentioned, also theater plays or poetry or everything in philosophy. So we are open for scholars mainly, and twice a month I have tours for visitors who just want to see the library. So I see Ets Haim as a research library, actually.
Yeah. I saw that you started a drive to find money to properly describe the books. And how's that going? Are you reaching your goal in terms of fundraising?
Well, it's very difficult. Well, the situation in the Middle East at the moment makes it very difficult to raise money for what we want, because we feel that this is not really the time to ask for money. So we stopped the funding for this moment.
Mhm.
And also it is quite difficult to find money. I mean, I guess that we are all, the audience, we are all book lovers. We can appreciate rare books from the 17th century or older. Our oldest book is from 1282. But it's sometimes very difficult to raise money for an old library, and especially for cataloging. At the same time, it's so important to catalog, because if you don't know out there what we have, you will not find your way to the library. It's very important that you know what we have. So we are optimistic, carefully optimistic, but at the moment we had to stop our campaign, and we hope to be able to continue during this year or maybe next year.
So if there is anyone in our public who feels that he can afford to support Ets Haim, please do. And maybe you can find a way to put your name upon the walls of the classroom of Ets Haim, like in the days of old.
There must be a way, and you would make me very happy, and a lot of other people in the world as well.
Yeah. Questions, anyone?
There's some questions on YouTube. First question is were women allowed into the library in the 17th century?
That's a very good question.
It is.
Yeah, it is, because we don't know. The school was for boys and men, and so not for women. I assume that the women didn't go to the library. If they were not allowed, I have no idea. I don't know. But
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, like in our days, whenever you have an educated man, you also have educated women. So they have been out there, but I don't know if they have been in the library or in school.
Yeah. And another question, where did the sort of printers of Atias and Castrotatas and Manasseh ben Israel and so forth, where did they actually learn to print? Is this in Amsterdam or Venice or somewhere else?
No, we don't know that much about it. So the example of Manasseh ben Israel, for example, we don't know. Later on, we know that a printer had apprentices, and those apprentices were founded their own printing press, and then you know how they learned. In Manasseh ben Israel's example, for example, we don't really know. No.
Okay, thank you. And there's question from Bruce. Thanks for a phenomenal presentation. In your study of the economics of publishing in Amsterdam, how do you see the use and extent of power of Sephardic Jews in media and communications in the 17th and 18th centuries, let's say, sort of Jewish control of the media, I suppose?
Yeah, I haven't thought about this, but in general, we all know that the Sephardic community in Amsterdam from the early days on, and also I would say still now, feel in a way or better. It sounds denigrating. That's not what I meant, but they had more means, they had more money, and also more power in that sense. So a lot of the early Hebrew printers were Sephardic, and if you have a printing press, you have the power to print what you want to print, as we have seen with Atias, for example, who said that that he has the power and he has the people. He was very much afraid of the power of the word. But I can also see that in the 17th century, with the manuscript culture, it is very clear that the Sephardic congregation was aware of the power of the word, be it in manuscript or be it in, printed. So that was absolutely clear. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, it's a very interesting question that I have to think more about. I like the question. Thank you very much for this.
Maria says, amazing presentation. What type of substrate was used? Was it vellum?
For printing?
I assume, yes.
Printing was done on paper, and also the manuscripts that we have are written on paper, because vellum is a very strong material, but it's quite difficult to write on vellum. So we have some parchment manuscripts, but they are older. Like the oldest that we have from 1282, for example, was written on parchment, and we have one or two others, but most of it is written or printed on paper.
With the exports, you mentioned a book fair, and you mentioned serving the sort of East European market and England and so forth. I mean, how would that work? Would they just find some sort of local sort of bookseller, distributor, or was there some more sophisticated system?
No, this is how it worked, like it works today, that you go, this is really to broaden your network. And I find it very interesting that Menasse, for example, only went once. If you look at the Antwerp printer Plantin, he went every year to the book fair, and he had his network there, and he built a network. And my idea is that Menasse, for example, he only wanted to get an idea of what was going on there, not so much that he felt that he would really do business there. There must have been something that he didn't feel was something for him, because he only attended in 1634, just one time.
Yeah. With the Haggadot, you showed how the sort of Amsterdam Haggadah was sort of copied in sort of Germany and Bohemia. I mean, obviously there weren't any sort of copyright laws then. I mean, do we know of cases where works are just sort of stolen and printed by others?
Yes, I mean, it happened. Copyright was not a right or law like you have now, but it already happened in the 17th century. And you will find correspondence about that, especially with printing, you will find that. And that had to do with the fact that printing was quite expensive. So a printer took quite a big risk if he printed, let's say, 3,000 Bibles. So he really had to ensure that no one else would print 3,000 Bibles in a certain time span. So copyright in that sense didn't exist, but we know of correspondence that that people tried to make sure that no one else would print the same book, let's say within 10 years.
Thank you. Ton, are there any more questions? Does anybody in the group have any questions they want to put themselves?
I have another question. Hundreds of students must have passed through the classes of Ets Haim. Did any of them become printers or authors themselves?
Of the students?
Of the students.
Menas ben Israel, Spinoza. I mean, just to name the most famous ones, but yes, a lot of them were also authors and printers and publishers and financiers. So like in our days, you are either one or the other. In the 17th century, you could be everything. And I mean, this is a good example of someone who really was everything. He wrote the manuscripts. He was the rabbi. He wrote the ketubot. He was a diplomat. He published. He printed. What didn't he? He sold the books. So yeah, many of the students from the library especially became authors. Not so much printers in some cases, but authors. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I think if there are no more questions, that it's...
There is one more question. Before closing the session, how did the library survive World War II?
That's a very important question. The library was closed during the Nazi occupation in Holland. Was closed for a while, and after that, the Nazis packed all the books into crates, and the books were shipped to Frankfurt, or close, a place very close to Frankfurt. It's called Hungen, where Hitler wanted to build this big, it's a kind of museum or institute for the research on the Jewish question. I always struggled with the translation. So he collected all the artwork and books from around Europe there. But the crates were actually never opened. So the collection came back more or less as it went there. So we were very lucky that we have the books back. I have to say that if you're thinking about the books that we lost, most of the books we lost after the war, because there was not really a congregation left, and the situation, the humidity, the books couldn't be kept very well. So sometimes people thought it's better to take books with them, to keep them at home, and maybe they never brought them back. Some books were stolen. So so the books that we lost after the war, and not so much during the war.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Heide, for a lovely presentation. As you get really nice reactions in chat, we'll copy that to you. And in 2 weeks' time, Sephardic World will present another talk, and we hope to all see you there. This was Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. And thank you all for watching. And thank you all, our patrons and our watchers on YouTube, and especially Heide. Thanks.
Thank you.
And see
You're
you.
welcome. It was a pleasure.